Okay, if everyone can take a seat as quick as possible, we'll get started because we've got quite a lot to get through today. So welcome back to Branding and Marketing Communications. I'm Robert Cleeley, I'm the module leader for the course and lecturer for the course. As always, just to remind you, you've got all my contact details on the slides. Please do feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions or concerns or comments at all. Last week was the first online lecture. I think Tassos had a look, and it looked like people had done something with that. Hopefully you've had a look at it. If not, it will be available throughout the rest of the term, so please do go and have a look at the online materials. I think you'll find that they might not seem useful to you yet, but when it comes to your dissertation, I think you'll find they're very, very useful for you. So what I want to do today is finish the last third of our discussion of sociological theories of branding and marketing communication. We didn't finish the last theory at the end of last week, so we're going to look at what's called structuration theory. This week I've mainly had people come to me to talk about the assessment, so I thought I'd give you some general advice about the assessment in this class as well, and what's expected on the assessment, some tips for starting the assessment, and hopefully try to give you a bit of a leg up. But then the main thing we want to do today is look at cultural studies or cultural theory as it has been applied to branding and marketing communications. So we've got quite a lot to get through today. I will start off with sociological theory, then we'll do the cultural theory, and then at the end we'll do the assessment. I thought that would be the best way to do it, so hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So let's finish sociological theory. If you can cast your mind back 2 weeks now, you'll remember, I hope, that we started exploring sociological accounts of branding and marketing communications. And sociological accounts of branding and marketing communications, just to remind you, aren't so interested in how branding or advertising changes one person's behaviour at a time. It's more interested in understanding what the effects of branding and marketing communications are on groups of people who have some shared language, shared ways of behaving, shared expectations, what we called 2 weeks ago a society. And we looked at a number of different perspectives. First, we looked at sociology of order, which says you have existing languages, discourses, ideas, norms, rituals, rules in a society. And brands and advertisers have to just respect them. This is the sociology of order. So it emphasises that society exists and branding and advertising doesn't really affect it in any way. It just reflects it. We then started to consider a sociology of change, and this reverses the relationship and says, perhaps there are important mechanisms in a society which shape the languages, rules, norms, expectations, and so on. And in that regard, a number of theorists have said branding and advertising is one of those mechanisms which can shape how people interact. So you hopefully remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about a Marxist approach. Marxist theorists of branding and marketing communications very much believe that if you have a society with branding and marketing communications, it changes that society. So it's a sociology of change. Okay, so we looked at those two perspectives. One says branding and marketing communications doesn't affect society. The other says it's a really important thing in shaping how people behave, how people react to each other, how they interact. The final theory, the one we didn't look at, is a little bit more complicated because it combines the two. And it's a more recent development in sociological theory, which is commonly known as structuration. It's called structuration to emphasize that a structure in a society, the order, is actually a process. So the idea is that society shapes branding and marketing communications. At the same time, branding and marketing communications can shape the society. Which probably makes a bit of sense because it combines both of these two perspectives. But actually it's really complicated if you then want to think of how is that structuration process, how does that actually work? The basic idea, I think, is simple enough. But let's try and work through an example which I find difficult to get my head around, so hopefully I'll try to I'll illustrate it in a way that makes sense to you. So one of the sociology of structuration approaches relates to a concept we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, which is semiotics. Semiotics is the study of meaning. So semioticians want to understand how is it that a brand can communicate value? How is it that an advert can persuade people? How does it construct a message? We talked about this in the first week. It's the process of encoding a message. And this is very much what semioticians are interested in, understanding how do you encode a message effectively so that it is decoded by the receivers effectively. And one of the things they've developed this whole technical vocabulary with terms like text and sign and denoted and linguistic and symbolic meaning and signifying and signified. Don't need to know all those details at this point. What we want to emphasize from a sociology of structuration is the idea that for a text to make meaning, you have to understand the society who made it and who's deconstructing it. Does that make sense? Let me keep going and see if I can help make more sense. So we work at these three levels, the linguistic, the symbolic, and the ideological. Semioticians say any sign, this is an example of one developed by a semiotician called Bronner, any text, any advert, works at three levels. The linguistic level is the literal meaning of the images, words, sounds in the message. So in this case, like this is a tomato. Right? And a tomato is a tomato. Is a tomato. It's just a tomato. It doesn't mean anything, it just means a tomato. It doesn't mean it's a tomato that you can throw at somebody, or a tomato that you can hit somebody with, or a tomato you can cook with and eat. It's just a tomato. Right? That's the linguistic message. The mushroom is just a mushroom. It's not a good mushroom, it's not a bad mushroom, it's just a mushroom. So the linguistic level is almost like looking at a dictionary and seeing what does something mean. When you start to combine all those linguistic elements together, then you can start to move to what they call the symbolic level, where things don't just represent themselves, they can start to represent other things. So if you look at this, all these things, hopefully you'll see this represents a meal. You've got pasta, onions, tomatoes, mushrooms. These are the ingredients to make a meal, right? And they're in a shopping bag, so it suggests somebody's just been and bought some ingredients to make a meal. That's what it symbolises. Now, it could have just shown you a cooked meal. Linguistically, it's a representative meal. The message doesn't. It uses all these linguistic elements, these literal elements, puts them together and you get a symbolic message. That makes sense? Yeah, a little bit hopefully. So the symbolic message then is constructed out of or emerges out of all of these literal meanings, but it's not literally in the text itself. So sort of misunderstand it. So if you've never had pasta with, tomato sauce, you can just look at this and go, I don't know what those things are. you didn't understand it. So it assumes the symbolic message, you come from a particular society, you have a certain amount of knowledge. This is a sociology order. So you already know this is a pasta sauce. So let me ask you, what country do you associate pasta sauce with? Italy, right? Yeah. So do you associate any colours with Italy at all? Do you know what the colours of the Italian flag are? Green, red, white. White, green, red. So it's starting to represent something like a bit Italian, right? There's a sense that this is kind of fresh pasta and this is like fresh pasta, it's a fresh meal, it's sort of Italian goodness. In his analysis of this, Roland Barthes says it symbolises a sense of Italianicity, like Italian stuff. That's what it symbolises. Not linguistically. It doesn't have literally the Italian flag and a picture of Italy, but it uses all these elements to symbolise something kind of Italian. Something about some fresh food, healthy living. It's kind of a lot of the ideas that I have of Italy. So that's the symbolic message which comes from this sociology of order. But at the same time, it's also teaching people that you add these things together and it represents Italy. Because you have things like the brand, which already has brand values in people's minds. So the consumer comes to it and they're able to construct and think, well, if you already knew this, Panzini sounds sort of Italian. And all the imagery is kind of Italian, so it starts to confirm itself. So at the same time as it's a sociology order, it starts to reinforce that order. But it could also change it. The other thing Roland Barthes says, then you can step behind that symbolic level, where we can decode the general message of the advert. So in this case, it's some sense of an Italian lifestyle as being very healthy. He says then they can start to think about a wider commentary on the society, which he calls the ideological meaning of the advert. And here you get things like, what this is representing is a society where there's lots of food, it's all very healthy, it's all very nice. This is a good society. It's a society where people have plenty to eat. They're not starving. It shows you people shopping. It's a shopping bag, so you know it's a consumer society. And his point is, at the same time as it uses those ideas to communicate that ideological message about consumption, health and abundance, it reinforces them. But you can also get examples which change them. So let's give you an example of that. This is BMW advert. I don't know if you can read the type, so I'll read it to you. It says, you know you're not the first. Okay? You know you're not the first. So, at the linguistic level, what's represented? Well, it says you know you're not the first, and there's a picture of a girl. So what's the meaning of that? It could be BMW. So what's the relevance of a girl to a BMW? Anybody got any ideas? Yeah.
It means you're not the first of the BMW and you're not the first of the girl.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, in order for it to make sense, you can't just look at each linguistic element, you have to put them together. Why? Because, in this case, it's actually an advert for used BMW cars. And what's the message? If you've got a used BMW car, it doesn't matter if it was new, because you've got a BMW car. In the same way, that if you're not the first person with this girl, it doesn't matter. That's it. Why does it not matter? It doesn't matter because this is an attractive girl. That's what this has to communicate. Otherwise, the message doesn't work. So what's this saying? This is telling us, This is not just promoting BMW, this is also telling us, this is constructing, we talked about in the first week, social construction. This is constructing what we think is beautiful. In order for this advert to make sense to us, we have to accept this is a beautiful girl. Okay? If you look back historically over time, people's ideas of what is beautiful have changed. In different societies, in different cultures, what's beautiful is not the same. But one of the things critics of branding, marketing, communications argue is that you get what they sometimes call a whitewashing when you get branding and advertising into a society. Where you see things like the image of beauty often tends to be people with white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes. It doesn't matter whether this advert's in China or South Africa or America or Brazil, where people might have very different bodies, faces, hair, eyes. The message is, this is beautiful. And a number of social theorists have been and looked at societies when you start to get branding and marketing communications, people change their idea of what is attractive, and they change how they then interact. Because if you look like this, you're beautiful, you're attractive, you're desirable. What's the other message? If you don't look like this, you need to change yourself to make yourself look like this. Does that make sense? Yeah? Yeah.
If they said that beautiful behavior about advertisement is not with the public idea, why it doesn't cause rejection?
Great question. So the question was, well, if this image of beauty is not accepted by their audiences, how does it still work? This is the point of structuration, that it's a process that takes a long time. So it's not simply the case, it's very rarely the case that an advertiser will present a really shocking image that they might do to get people's attention, to get them to process their message, to be controversial. Sometimes in marketing strategy, they talk about shock advertising. This is we'll talk about it later on, of course, a highly effective strategy that you can do, present an image which goes against socially accepted norms in a society to get people's attention, to shock them. Right? It can cause a backlash. It's risky, you can't do it all the time. But the point being, and that's what we're going to get onto in this class, if you look across lots and lots and lots of adverts, lots and lots of branding initiatives, you find that they have similarities. So it's not just the case that this one advert is saying this is a beautiful girl. You can look at lots of adverts with beautiful girls in, and they all look very similar to this. Does that answer your question? Remember, social theorists aren't trying to explain consumers' reactions. They're trying to think what happens to a society. Okay? So, the sociology of structuration, the idea that for a brand or an advert to make sense, it has to reflect something that makes sense to the society already. It has to present linguistic images, words, and so on and so forth, which make sense to consumers. To construct symbolic messages, those linguistic elements have to combine, and you get this new message. Like, this is a BMW is an attractive car. It doesn't say that, but it does say it. But then you get this further ideological message, which reconfirms or at times starts to structurate or shift the society. In this case, I would argue it can shift what we might think is beautiful, but it can shift lots of other things as well. How you're supposed to interact with each other, what you're supposed to do when you go on a date, how you're supposed to behave as a child or an adult. This is structuration of work. So how does it do that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in the remainder of this class. Is advertising does that structuration by showing very set, ways of interacting to different societies. So, another way of thinking about this, which is actually... yeah. Which one? This one? Yeah, great. Yeah. The ideological meaning of this picture. Well, I would argue there's a racial ideological meaning of this picture, right? So, white skin is better than non-white skin. I don't think that personally. But for it to make sense, right? This advert says, you know you're not the first. So that means you're supposed to look at this and imagine that you've just had sexual relations with this woman. That's why she looks like she's got no clothes on. She looks like she's lying down and dead. Right? You know what's happening here. It doesn't have to say, this girl has just had sex with you, linguistically, but it can symbolise it. Right? So, the idea then, this is about desire. What is desirable? What's attractive? That girl is attractive. So, it starts to represent particular assumptions about skin colour, body type, body image. Who do you think is the person who's just had sexual relations with this girl? Man or woman? Man. Right? It doesn't have to say it, but now it's starting to have some ideological ideas about what kind of sexual relationships are appropriate and inappropriate. A heterosexual one. Would this be the same message if it had a picture of a very handsome man in it? No. Would it be advertising or assuming that the person who's going to buy a car is different if it had a man in it? Yeah, right, because then it would say women are the ones that buy BMWs, not men. Which would mean women have to have good jobs so they can buy BMWs because they cost a lot of money. So the ideological assumptions in this image is very much a man wants to buy an expensive car because it's like having an attractive woman. And an attractive woman, what is attractive? Something that looks like this. Does that answer the question?
What is the symbolic meaning of this?
The symbolic meaning is precisely this idea. A used BMW is a good car. Now, it doesn't say that, but it communicates it. It symbolises it by having an attractive girl, by having the sentence, you know you're not the first. So here's my question. Why does it say, you know you're not the first to have had sex with this girl? Why does it not say that? Goes back to your question, because that would then say this is explicitly about sex, which might make consumers not like it, because it might be a bit too controversial. Because your kid might open it up and say, oh, sex. Or you might be at a grandma's house and the grandma looks at it and it's very embarrassing. Because that's not how we're supposed to behave. So then we get to this other idea, right? It's about sex, but we don't talk about sex. In most relative sense. So the linguistic element, just to repeat myself, I'm sorry I confused you. The linguistic element is literally what does this represent? Well, that represents the girl. When it's a photograph, it is not a girl, it's a photograph of a girl. So linguistically, that's what it represents. Symbolically, it's an attractive girl. So to think about that process of structuration, you can also go even further, not just dealing with abstract terms. What researchers have done is they've been in and looked to see how do people decode messages. And in quite a famous study by Nick and Gould in the early 1990s, they did a series of studies with 3 triplets. So 3 brothers who had grown up in the same society, they'd gone to the same school, they lived in the same house with the same parents, so they all came from the same society. And they showed them adverts, and then they said, what do these adverts mean to you? And they found that these 3 brothers interpreted the adverts all slightly differently, depending on their life projects. So there was one of the brothers who developed to be very fashion conscious, and he always wanted to have the latest clothes and the latest gadgets. So he interpreted them from that angle. There was one brother who developed to be a little bit more lazy and liked to smoke pot, I think, and like get drunk and stuff. So he interpreted them very differently. But Michel's point was the kind of the structuration, the symbols go into individual consumers' heads, and they could just shift the interpretations a little bit. They can't make it up completely because they've been given this ordered sign, which makes sense symbolically and ideologically. But they can just interpret it a little bit. And in that process of just interpreting a little bit, if enough people interpret it a little bit all the same way, that's how you then get some level of change. Okay, so that's the sociology of structuration, right? I appreciate it's easy to think about that interrelationship, but when you try to think about how it actually works, it's quite difficult. And one of the benefits of it being difficult is lots of people are trying to research it and understand it. I hope I've presented it as best I can. Has anybody got any questions before we move on? No? Good. Okay, so let's move on to cultural theory, the cultural analysis of branding and marketing communications. Fortunately, this really matches what we've just been talking about. It really matches the idea. It gives us an explanation, I should say, of the ways that branding and marketing communications can change a society. But it focuses on the cultural angle. So it focuses on the ways that branding and marketing communications can shape our understanding of the world. Not necessarily the actual world, not necessarily actual relationships between people within a society, but our understanding, the way we think about those relationships. That's what we mean by culture. Okay. So I'll just go through it. We're going to look at 4 different perspectives. One of the dominant explanations in cultural theory is called cultivation theory or cultivation analysis, or something like that. We're going to look at cultural values research, which is a very specific marketing application of cultural theory. We're going to look at the movement of meaning model, which is an application of cultural theory to branding and marketing communications practice. And then I want to review some critical perspectives that have emerged in cultural studies. So I'm going to try some of it I can hopefully go through relatively quickly to give us plenty of time to discuss the assessment. But if I'm going too quick or I've confused myself or confused you, please do ask questions. So why cultural theory? The starting point for cultural theorists is similar to that of social theorists or sociologists. Think back to a couple of weeks ago. The justification, for sociological analysis was that branding and marketing communications might have some effects beyond individual consumers, might have some effect on a society. Well, that's pretty much the same for cultural theorists, but rather than thinking just about societies as the relationships between groups and how people interact and a lot of things we talked about a couple weeks ago, cultural theorists are only interested in the ways that branding and marketing communications shapes culture. Right? And what's culture made up of? It's made up of images, values, norms, language. Language. Spot that right, yeah. So a lot of similar things to social theorists, but they're much more interested in the abstract ideas, whereas social theorists are also literally interested in how groups of people interact. Are you poor? Are you rich? We talked quite a lot about this a couple of weeks ago. Do you have lots of money? Do you not have lots of money? That's what sociologists are interested in as well. Cultural theorists are just interested in these abstract ideas. And they're interested in thinking about the effects of branding and advertising on our abstract ideas about the world. So, there's cultural effects is the starting point. Branding and marketing communications can change language, images, values, norms. Those are effects. The next question, which is really the central point of cultural theory, is to understand the mechanisms through which those effects are achieved. So we're going to look at a couple of different accounts today, some which focus on the effects of branding and marketing communications on culture. What does it do to culture? And then some which look at the mechanisms of how does it do things to culture. So keep those two things in mind. Some focus on the effects and trying to measure the effects. Some focus on the mechanisms and trying to understand the mechanisms through which those effects are achieved. Cultural theory is also incredibly prominent in marketing communications practice because a lot of brand theory, practitioner brand theory, assumes that the ultimate aim of branding and marketing communications is cultural, is to create a brand value, is to create a brand image or a brand meaning or a brand personality. The ultimate aim for many brands is to become what's called an icon. We'll talk about this a bit later on in class, where your brand literally represents the product itself. So a good example would be something like Coke or Hoover. My mum does the hoovering, which is vacuuming. Right? Vacuuming, the word vacuum cleaning, cleaning the carpet, in my culture is replaced by the word Hoover. Hoover is a brand that makes one vacuum cleaner. In the same way that, it's maybe not so applicable to everybody, but you'll often hear someone say Google it. Well, Google is a brand of search engine. People don't say search engine it, they say Google it, right? Or Coke. Say, do you want some Coke? Well, Coke is a brand of drink, but it's come to represent all cola-flavoured drinks. For brand theorists, this is often the ultimate aim. If you can become the brand that represents your entire product category, when a consumer is doing their information search, what's the first one they'll go to? They'll go to Coke, because it represents the whole product. So cultural theory is both academic, scholarly, but it's also, we're going to see, really, really influential in practice. One of the things which I do when I do my research with advertising agencies is look to see, do they have books around? And normally advertising agencies have lots of books, and normally most of them come from cultural theory. Often critical accounts that we're going to look at later on in the study. Okay. So, just to put a little bit of meat onto this, what are some of the cultural effects? Well, there have been all manner of cultural effects that have been suggested. Anthropologists, ethnographers have argued that when you have brands and marketing communications in a culture, it affects literally the language that people use. Like, for example, with Hoover and vacuum cleaning. So you get what's called, they call it a coffee talk, where people say, should we go to Starbucks? And they use brand terminology in their everyday language. Makes sense why people would do that, because if I say Hoover it, and we've all got Hoover, that makes sense. But that means the brand has been able to literally change the language. They've created a new word that means something that didn't exist before. This guy, who isn't me, but looks like me, and I sort of wish he was me, but he's dead, so I don't. But he's a very famous writer. He's a guy called David Foster Wallace, and one of the things he argued is that it's not just the case that a brand can create meaning for its own word, can change language by adding a word like Google to the language. There's also a more systematic, aggregate, big effect. So if you look across adverts, brands often use a very small proportion of language. There's thousands, millions of words in English, but if you look at the words that are used in adverts, there's a tiny little bit on. And he said what happens is, because people know that advertisers use those words, they've actually started to change the meaning of those words. Not just the brand name, but that vocabulary that you see in adverts. So he gives the example of special. So in English, the word special means different, unique, one of a kind. But because lots of advertisers say we are a special brand, we've got a special offer, special starts to be less special. So then what you get is people saying very special, or super special, or mega special, which basically is the same as special. But because brands and advertisers use special so much, they've changed the meaning of it. Okay? So he talks about this thing, advertising English. There's a vocabulary of words in any culture, which are the words which brands use a lot, and because brands use them a lot, people have changed the meaning of them when they read them. So when you read a special offer, you don't go, wow, that's a one in a kind, you just think, it's just an offer. Which is then what forces brands to say mega special. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's one cultural effect that cultural theorists have pointed out. If you look to see what happens in a culture when you have branding and advertising, it changes the language. Unfortunately, I only speak English, so all my examples are in English, but it's changed English. Another thing it's done is change how people construct their own identities. So cultural theorists are very big on understanding people's identities. How is it that you distinguish yourself from other people? Or signal that you are the same as other people. Cultural theorists argue one way in a culture with branding and advertising is through the brands that you consume. This is why we have brand names on our t-shirts and on the front of our hoodies, to tell everybody else, look at the brand that I've bought. So in a culture where you have brands, people start to use those brands to construct their identity, their idea of who they are. And when you interact with other people, according to this theory, you will also be taking account of the types of brands people consume, the types of things that they like. And you'll be using that to make sense of their identity and whether they're somebody that you'd like to be friends with. Make sense? Yeah, okay. So these are some cultural effects. One of the starting points for cultural theory is the idea that just as a text, as a thing that we look at, branding and advertising is one of the most prominent forms of text that most of us see every day. So there's no hard statistics, but it's estimated that people can see up to 5,000 adverts a day. People don't look at that many pictures a day. People don't listen to that many songs a day. They don't watch that many films a day. They don't read that many poems a day. They don't go to that many plays or the theatre that much. So it's been argued by cultural theorists that advertising is the dominant text that people interact with, which has a symbolic meaning. So they've argued that you can analyse those texts in the same way that if you go to our humanities department, people will sit around and talk about books and poetry and paintings. Cultural theorists say we can look at these texts to try to understand the culture. The text tells something about the culture. Okay, so cultural theory says branding and marketing communications can have very big effects on a culture. It can change how we communicate, the language that we have, how we construct our sense of identity, how we understand the world around us. So how to do it? Cultivation theory is the preeminent, most accepted explanation for the ways that any cultural text can shape the society, the culture, in which it operates. The basic point in cultivation theory is that we live in a cultural world and we live in the real world. Okay? So if you spend all day playing video games, that has the ability to shape what you think is true, because you're spending so much time living in the video game. If you just watch loads and loads of cartoons or loads and loads of TV, you can spend more time in that TV world than in the real world. And cultivation theory says, the more time you spend in that video game world or in that TV world, the more likely you are to think it is the real world. So what cultivation theorists do is they do big content analyses. They look at cultural texts to see, are there systematic trends or patterns or relationships in the ways that the world is presented in a cultural text. And then the next step of the studies would be to interview or to survey people that spend a lot of time consuming those cultural texts and see, do they think the real world is more like the cultural texts than the real world actually is? So do people that play video games a lot think the world is more violent than it is? Because video games are violent. This is a classic example. What cultivation theorists have found is, inevitably, the more time somebody spends in the cultural world, the more likely they are to think the real world is like that. So if you read newspapers, which are constantly telling you that there's going to be climate change, the more likely you are to believe in climate change. If you read newspapers that always tell you all this gossip and talk about how corrupt politicians are, the more likely you are to think politicians are corrupt. You read newspapers that tell you that immigrants are going to come and steal all of your things, the more likely you are to think that's going to happen. Irrelevant of what's happening in the real world. This is that cultivation theory. Does that make sense to everyone? What about advertising? Good question. So, if the dominant cultural form that most of us interact with is advertising, not video games, not TV, not newspapers, advertising must be able to cultivate or change people's understanding of the world. If there are, sorry for flicking between the slides, if there are systematic patterns in the ways that they present the world. Does that make sense? Well, let me give you some examples. This is an example of a study that I did on marketers and the way that marketing is presented in newspapers in the UK. And one of the things that I found in this study was that, you don't need to go through the numbers too much, but that marketers are often presented as being male. And if you speak to marketing graduates in the UK, women often feel like marketing is a boy's job. Even though it's not, there's more women that are employed in marketing in many instances. But because it's presented as being male, people think it is. And this is what we do in cultivation theory. We try to find trends in the way that something is presented and then see if those trends play out in the real world. So, yeah, as I put it here, researchers use content analysis, often in cultivation theory, to think about how different groups of people interact. So, men and women, different races and ethnicities, different nationalities, different types of people. How are they presented and what are they presented as doing? So, some examples. One of the things which cultivation theorists have found is that across adverts, across branding campaigns, when you just look at one or two, you don't realise it, but if you look across hundreds or thousands of adverts, you realise they're incredibly racially biased. What do we mean? Well, in adverts, there's often a high-status person and a low-status person. The high-status person is the person that has power, has money, has choices, is the one that can do the choosing. The low-status person is the person that doesn't have power, doesn't have money, doesn't have control of the situation. And often, not always, but often, there are very, very strict racial divides in advertising who has those roles. Now, I'm going to show some examples here. What I want to point out, I don't believe in any of these things, but I want to suggest to you that they're true. So here's an example of a washing powder advert. Right, so who has the power in that advert? Who's the high status character? The woman, right? Who's the low status character? This guy.
Yeah, tip when you're stuck in an awkward situation.
Too easy. KFC's crowd pleaser. A huge variety of delicious chicken and plenty of tasty sides.
Right. So who's the high status person in this advert? Who has the power? Well, let's think about what's happening. This is in a crowd at a sports arena. There's one guy who happens to have white skin who's trying to sit down and watch the sport. And then there's a lot of other people who have non-white skin who are being loud and noisy. He doesn't like it, so what does he do?
Yeah, tip when you're stuck in an awkward situation.
Too easy.
He gives them all KFC chicken, and they're all quiet. Again, this person is high status. He has the power. He just has to give people chicken. He can get them to do what he wants. These people don't have the power. So cultivation theorists look to see, are there trends across adverts in the way that different races are presented? And they find that yes, there is. Even within this advert, what happens to this guy? He goes into a washing machine, and when he comes out, what's happened to his skin? It's got whiter. So even though there are no Caucasian white people in this, it's already got some implicit racial biases. Another popular topic of study in cultivation theory is the presentation of gender, and particularly the ways that women are presented. In the same way that non-white people are often presented as being low status, cultivation theorists argue often women and particular types of women are presented as being low status in advertising.
Hello, I'd like to order French fries, burger, and a milkshake. This is a library. I'd like to order French fries, a burger, and a milkshake.
Right? Oops. This woman's beautiful, but she's stupid. Right? The assumption being, beautiful women like this are stupid. Often in advertising, when it presents gender, it will present particular types of women typically as being the object of desire, something that you can consume, something low status. Oops, what's happened? Wait. Sorry.
This piece is aggressive, and it's called Mother.
And what about this one?
Well, that one looks great. Fits well, clean lines, keeps all of your stuff tucked in.
You're talking about my jeans, aren't you?
Yes. Who's the artist?
Old Navy.
Oh, I love his work.
No, it's a store.
Explain.
It's the new mid-rise rock star. If you try on any pair of jeans right now, you get $5 off.
I'll bid 50,000.
All jeans out.
Okay. Right, so well, this is a great point to stop it, right? What do you remember about this advert? Right? The woman's butt, right? That's what's being consumed in this advert. Before you even know what the brand is or what it's for, it's about women's butts. That's what this advert is for. So cultivation theory says in the same way that you get high status and low status ethnicity, you get high status and low status genders presented in adverts. And particular types of bodies, particular types of images presented as being attractive, having particular values associated with them, like being stupid or clever. So in this advert, which is the clever woman? This one. Unfortunately, this wouldn't come up properly, but this speaks to your question earlier on. So the question was, what happens if an advertiser presents something that goes against social norms? This advert, I'll just play it to you and I'll explain why I show it.
I love my husband Jeff. I love my girlfriend Kate. I love swimming. I loathe swimming.
Whoever you are, you could get Cashback Plus rewards just for using your NatWest debit card. Earn at least 1% of your spend in rewards at selected retailers. So whether you've been with us for a while or you're just joining us, feel rewarded every day with Cashback Plus. NatWest. Helpful banking.
Did anybody notice anything about this advert? Anything strange? No? Okay. Let me play it again.
I love my husband Jeff. I love my girlfriend Kate.
This is the first advert which showed a non-heterosexual couple in the UK. Homosexuality used to be illegal in the UK until the sort of mid-1950s. After that, it was legal. This is the first advert which showed a homosexual couple in it. First advert. It was released a couple of years ago, over 50 years later. Why? Because although something was socially acceptable, advertisers thought it was going to be offensive. They didn't want to upset their audiences. But over time, that starts to shift. Attitudes start to shift. Society starts to change and be structurated to the point where after 50 years, advertisers were comfortable showing a homosexual couple. And why? Because they want to advertise, they want all types of people to go and have bank accounts with NatWest. It's no longer going to be offensive. It might have offended some people. And since this time, there's now been lots of adverts which show homosexual couples. Lots, with huge growth. I mean, it's comparative. It's not gone to loads of them, but there's much, much more. Given that there was 1 in 50 years, there's now been like 100 in the last 5 years. So cultivation theory says that if you step back and actually analyse branding and marketing communications texts as a whole, what you find is that they do depict different people in different social roles, doing different jobs, having different statuses, having power, being objects that are consumed, or being people that are doing the consuming. And cultivation theory says the more time people are going to spend around those advertised images, the more likely they are to think that the world is like the way it's advertised. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, like if advertising and branding can have the effect of shaping how people's image is attractive, do they have the same effect to women as men, or often that is more like a biological thing for attractiveness?
Okay, right, so the question then is, when it comes to an issue like attractiveness, and what people think is attractive, is part of it biological and part of it cultural? Well, that's that's a very interesting question. Well, it's probably outside the scope of the course. Cultivation theorists would say what happens is advertising only affects the cultural. It doesn't affect the biological. So perhaps people have some biological drives. I don't know, I'm not a biologist. So talking a little bit outside my area of expertise. But the cultivation theorists would say it can affect the cultural. And then this is the empirical question as to whether the cultural affects males or females more. So you have to actually go and study to see, does it have more of an effect on men and women? I suspect the answer would be, in most studies, it affects both equally, but in different ways. So the ways that men are presented as being attractive and have their ideas of being beautiful for themselves is different to the ways that women's bodies are affected or changed by cultivation. But that the mechanism is the same. Does that answer your question at all? I don't think it does it? Email me if it didn't. I hope it did a little bit. Any other questions? Thanks, Preston. But that is a useful critique of cultivation theory, like, well, where is the limits of culture? The second set of research that I wanted to look at today, and I apologise for rushing through, is what's called cultural values research. Cultivation theory tends to look at the ways that people are presented and what those people are presented as doing. So it tends to be an explanation for why men behave in certain ways, why women behave in certain ways, why particular races or sexualities think that they have a particular position in society. Cultural values doesn't look at people, it looks at the abstract ideals that are presented in branding and marketing communications. And it starts from the idea that all of the things that branding and marketing communications does as a whole is shape our idea of what's called good, or the good life. So it says, what do most brands try to advertise? They try to advertise that if you consume their product, your life will be better. So what most adverts try to show you is what a better life looks like. Okay? What a good life looks like. And cultural values researchers then say, well, let's think about what are the elements of that good life, that better life, that life that you should be trying to live, that are presented to us in advertising campaigns and branding campaigns. And the mechanism is the same, in the same way that cultivation theory says the more time people spend living in the advertising world, the more likely they are to think the real world is like the advertising world. Cultural values researchers say the same thing. The more time people spend consuming branding and marketing communications, the more their image of what's good is shaped by the values of marketing communications and branding. So they'll do a similar thing. Instead of going and analysing branding and marketing communications to see what people are doing, they'll look to see what's presented as being good in this advert. And then they do content analysis and track it over time. So this is a good example. Mature, youth, or healthy. Which do you think brands tend to be promoting as being good? Do you think it's going to be being mature, being young, or being healthy? Or the opposite, being dead, old, or unhealthy? It's going to be these things, right? Because these are good. It's good to be mature, it's good to be young, it's good to be healthy. But you can't necessarily advertise all of those values all at the same time. So brands often have to kind of pick them, and you can track over time in different cultures how branding presents particular images of what is good to particular types of people. So this is a sample, I think, from the States. Look at the mature one. Nothing, 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 1%, nothing, 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 1%. So in North America, is it good to be old, according to branding and marketing communications? No. Because that's never presented as the good life. Is it good to be young? Well, a little bit better. 3, 3, 11, 8, 2, 4, 3, 3, 2. Is it good to be healthy? Yes. 28% of adverts say, tell you your life will be better if you consume this product because it will make you healthier. So cultivation theory tells you the mechanism. Cultural value says it's not just about our understanding of people that gets affected, but what we think of as being the good life that we should aspire to. And on this view, cultures which have got brands and advertising that are qualitatively different from those without them. If you read into the cultural values analysis, they'll often compare consumer societies or brand societies against more traditional societies. And they will argue that you see like the opposite trends in lots of traditional societies where maturity is often valued. There are some societies, some cultures where it's a good thing to have wisdom, to be mature. Old people are to be respected and emulated, and people try to be more mature than they are. But in branded societies, according to this body of research, old people try to be younger than they are. Because it's better to be young than old in branded societies. Okay? Does that make sense? No. What doesn't make sense? The whole thing? Okay, right. So the question was, well, like in this example, why is it a bad life to be old? Well, so cultural values theorists, they don't say why, they just say it has. So they're not arguing that it should be good or bad. What they're saying is if you look in branding and marketing communications over time, you see that the image that's presented to people as being good tends to be young. And that this will shape the culture to be more focused on valuing youthfulness. Not necessarily young people, but that no matter what age you are, you think it's better to be younger and healthy. Okay? Why that is the case is what they're interested in. So this is a good question though. So the point is, cultural values theorists don't really care what these things are. All they're interested in showing is that across groups of adverts over time, you see different values being promoted and different values being demoted in different cultures. So it's not saying all cultures should value youth over maturity. It's not what we call a normative theory. It's a descriptive theory. It's saying in this culture, which I think was North America, branding and marketing communications promoted youth over maturity. You might be able to distinguish this culture from another culture by finding one where maturity is promoted in their branding and marketing communications. That's fine. So it's not saying that it should be good or bad, just that it's presented in that way. Does that make sense? Good, thank you for your question. Yeah?
Is that cultivated or
Cultivated. Why is it cultivated? This is a great question. Is this saying this is cultivated or something which is shaped by cultural texts or inherent in people? The cultural theorists, and it goes back to the question that was asked earlier on, their only focus is on the cultural. They're not interested in the biological, the things that are inherent in people. So a biologist or a psychologist might say, well, actually, the reason we value youth over age is because we have an inbuilt fear of dying. So we want to try and stay healthy and as young as possible for as long as possible because we don't want to die. That might be true, I don't know. Cultural theorists aren't interested in that question. They're only interested in thinking about culture, right? So what's culture? Language, images, values, norms. So they're only interested in thinking, how does branding shape images, language, values, and norms? So that's the question.
Is that mean the convention theory is like telling why like young is good and so make you shape your behavior to like to have to stay young, and then cultural values is like to just tell you youth is good.
Yeah.
So it's like the first one explain the next process, and then just tell you the second one just tell you. So,
Yeah, perfect. So the comment was, you said it much better than I could say. Cultivation theory is the process through which culture changes. Cultural values explores some changes in culture. So cultivation theory says, here is how culture changes. It changes by systematic trends within brand and marketing communication. Cultural values says one of the really important things to look at is not just race or gender, but also what is presented as being good. What is presented as being something people should desire or aspire to. And in this example, it's being young. Now, like I say, you might find a different culture. If you look into the research, you will find there are different cultures which value different things. The theoretical point, the cultivation theory point is, well, that shows us then branding and marketing communications can have an effect on culture, and relevance of what it is. And then you have like a social question. Do you want to regulate or shape the types of values that brands can present?
Are there any evidence that shows that they advertise other parts instead of the impact of cultural changes?
Sorry.
Are there any evidence show that the advertisements cultivation effect is not the cause, is the cause, but not the effect of social change?
Yeah. So the really good question. So that relates back to the social theories issue that we talked about earlier on. Is does advertising reflect its culture or shape its culture? That's a brilliant question. Cultural values theorists would say it can shape culture over time. How does it do it? By starting to promote particular values. Now the question is, why would advertisers do that? Because an advertiser doesn't care if it promotes youth or old age as long as it gets you to buy a product. And this is one of the defense that brands often will have against this line of analysis and say, we're not shaping anything, we're just reflecting culture. Empirically, cultivation theorists say that is sort of true, but it's structure-oriented. So brands tend to reflect culture, but sometimes when they want to get people's attention, they'll show a homosexual couple. And then once they've shown that homosexual couple, that can now start to be a value which appears here, and more of them might do it. They might not, but they might. So it's possible to change. But it's an empirical question. It's not the case that it happens the same everywhere all the time. Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yeah? Yes, exactly. So the idea is any changes across time that in cultural values research works through cultivation. It works by changing the inherent values, trends, patterns which are depicted. So over time, you see like here, being neat it starts off in the 1900s that only 10% of adverts showed that as being a good thing. Okay. But then over time, it starts to become 20%, 25%, 30%. So it's cultivating a different image. And then it starts to drop back. Now, that might be because of a change in the wider culture that these people are no longer persuaded by being neat. Or it might be because branding and advertising has changed that wider culture. It's an empirical question that you have to then go and investigate. And that's what you see with cultural values research.
So the change of cultural values institute conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So changes in cultural values is the effect. Cultivation is the process. Okay. Any other questions?
You mentioned cultural values to explore such images.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So the question is, I said before that cultural values can explore changes in culture. That's an empirical question. So do you know what I mean when I say an empirical question? So that's something that they go to test. They actually go and look at adverts and branding and marketing communications to see, are there changes in the cultural value? Okay. They're not saying there are or there aren't. Theoretically, they go in and actually looking at data to see what happens. And then they try to explain, why does that happen? Does it happen because of something unrelated to branding and marketing communications, or because of something branding and marketing communicators do? Was it the case that somebody does an advert that's really different, and all of a sudden it's really effective, so lots of other people change? That would be a sociological change. Do people do the opposite? It's an empirical question, so people go out and test it. Okay, so we've looked at cultivation theory as a process. We've looked at cultural values research as a description of the state of cultivation. The third body of research I wanted to look at was what's called the movement of meaning model. The movement of meaning model looks more specifically at particular elements of culture, not trends in the ways that people are presented or trends in the ways that cultural values are presented, but it looks at the relationship between different cultural texts to see how does a brand ultimately has it able to become a text and something which has meaning itself. And one of the arguments in the movement of meaning model is that you have a culture which has got texts and meanings, and through the process of advertising, some of those meanings get transferred to a brand. And ironically, of course, it can be structurated so the things can interact with each other. So over time, you can get the brand becoming a text with its own meaning. Okay? So it focuses on the movement of meaning. And again, it's an empirical, well, it's a theory, but it's tested empirically. You look to see how does the meaning associated with a particular brand become associated with it? Where does it come from? Does it come from the wider culture? Does the brand create it and then add it into the culture? So this is the basic movement of meaning model in consumer research. We'll just talk through it really quickly. Basically, you have this culturally constituted world. So you have the natural biological world, you have your inbuilt tendencies, but ultimately, it's the world in our heads which counts. This is a cultivated world. It's a world shaped by cultural texts and the trends in cultural texts and the values in cultural texts. And the argument is that through advertising, some of those meanings get passed on to consumer goods. Right, so if it's good to be young, an advert emphasises that a brand is associated with youth, that meaning gets transferred onto the brand or onto a product. And so now the product becomes being young. Make sense? The next step is the consumer consumes that product. And they're not just consuming the product, they're also consuming the meaning. So they get to feel more youthful because they're consuming a youthful brand. Okay? They get to feel more neat and tidy because they're consuming a neat and tidy brand. So what we're going to talk about today is this angle. The cultural movements of meaning model really looks at like the relation between the culturally constituted world, consumer goods, individual consumers, and their background to explore how does meaning from culture move on to a consumer good into an individual consumer's mind, and what's the interrelationships between them. I've got a really good example, which is a little bit long, but I really want to play it because I like the music. So this is a video exploring the interrelationships between a brand of mustard called Grey Poupon and hip-hop music. And what you see is that hip-hop rappers talk about Grey Poupon because it had a particular meaning, and then because it's talked about in rap music, that meaning changes, and then the brand actually takes that meaning back and uses it again in its advertising campaigns. So you'll be able to see, hopefully, this interrelationship between the culture and the brand, where the meaning moves between the two. So let's talk. Oops.
This is one of my favorite hip-hop records. It's a Ghostface Killah's Iron Man, released in 1996. Listen to Fish, the 9th track on the record. Yes, this archetypal Ghostface verse is cryptic, stream of consciousness, and in your face. But it also gave me a sense of deja vu. That's because 4 tracks before, you'll hear this verse from Raekwon. Wu-Tang must just love Grey Poupon. It makes sense, they rap about food a lot. But as I was working on a video about Kanye West, I heard him too rap this on his 2016 song, Facts.
Easy, this is pure production. I give him Grey Poupon on a DJ Mustard.
That's fully 20 years later. I listened to hip-hop all day long, so I started logging anytime I heard Grey Poupon referenced in rap lyrics. It turns out, Grey Poupon is everywhere. Why is this little jar of fancy mustard so ubiquitous in rap music? Well, it starts here.
The finer things in life, happily some are affordable, like Grey Poupon Dijon mustard.
These ads started in 1981, and immediately they were a hit. When the first ad was tested in Seattle, the brand reportedly saw a 100% jump in sales. They tested it again in New England, and the same jump in sales happened, proving it wasn't a fluke. Previously, the brand had only ever used print advertising to appeal to an upper-class audience. But mustard was the condiment of the 80s, and Grey Poupon wanted a piece of the pie, even at a higher price point.
So, Grey Poupon is meant to represent high-class living. That's its meaning, that it's a high-class luxury product, okay?
A jar of Grey Poupon was nearly double the price of French's or Golden's. So in 1981, this ad aired, telling consumers across the U.S. that Grey Poupon was gourmet and affordable, while the phrase, "Pardon me, would you have any Grey Poupon?" inserted itself into the American lexicon. Over the next 10 years, the campaign emphasized the mustard's affordability, while traveling on trains, planes, and yachts. This, of course, brings us to the early 90s, when Nabisco wanted to change up the campaign.
I said to the client, you have a pretty memorable campaign here. You hardly spend any money at all. I think that you should not change the campaign, but we should just figure out a way to make it more approachable.
That's Lee Garfinkel. He worked for the agency that made the ads.
Yeah, so we came back with the idea of the guys kind of poking fun at each other.
You, this is about the mustard again. Yes. Would you have some? Oh, since you're offering, yes, thank you, I would.
They added a squeeze bottle to emphasize that Grey Poupon was a fancy mustard you could use every single day. And sales took off again. That same year, DOS Effects, the influential East Coast hip-hop duo, began recording their debut album, Dead Serious.
Right, so the meaning of the brand is it's gourmet and luxury, but it's also affordable. Right? And then you'll start to see how rappers use the brand when they want to express something about living a luxury lifestyle that's also affordable.
DOS Effects are the ones who crammed multiple syllables in a bar by adding iggity at the end of words. When Dead Serious was released in 1992, it went platinum, and the single They Want Effects quickly reached the top 10 on the Billboard charts. But it's the song East Coast that marked what is probably the first Grey Poupon reference in hip-hop history. Within that same month, Wayne's World premiered.
Pardon me, do you have any Grey Poupon?
By the spring of 1992, this glass jar of bougie white wine mustard spread across the pop culture landscape and started one of the weirdest trends in hip-hop music.
Fuck no, I ain't got no Grey Poupon.
Well, anyway, I said, that's her burger, that's my Fanta. Mr. Rockefeller, let me in on the gossip. I heard you was to get it, that's me doing that music.
Yes, we have this thing we do with all boys.
This chart shows the rise of Grey Poupon in recorded music from 1992 to 2016. And it reveals something really interesting about how words are used in hip-hop culture.
This particular brand of Dijon mustard has been like referenced a lot in rap music. I've used it a bunch. It comes up in freestyles all the time.
That's rapper Open Mike Eagle.
And I think in this particular phrase, there's a couple reasons for it. In one aspect, I think it's just how convenient of a rhyme it is. And it rhymes with like coupon, and neutron, and futon, and like all these things that are kind of around.
26 and I done lived a lifetime a few times. Times with Grey Poupons. In church trying to get a little savings here at Coupon. I spent that A1 every day, I'm hitting new crimes.
Out of 100.
Right, I'll stop it there because we're going to run out of time otherwise. But can you see how you get this brand that has this meaning, and then it starts to get used back into cultural texts and rap music and movies, and that meaning then becomes part of this culturally constituted world. So like there, in that last rant, Eminem was trying to emphasise how he's sort of had a hard life, and part of having his hard life was that he consumed Grey Poupon mustard, right? Because it was affordable, and he was looking up, he wanted to live a luxury lifestyle. His aspiration. This is the movement of meaning more. And ultimately, you get to this idea that I wrote on the board earlier of the icon. What an icon is an example of a brand becoming the meaning itself. Right, so it either means the cultural value, product category, whatever it is. It literally comes to stand for it, such that if you wanted to represent it, that meaning, you just say the brand. So in rap music, when they want to express something that's luxury but affordable, they don't say luxury but affordable, they say pass the Grey Poupon. It becomes the brand means the thing. In a sense, the meaning has been completely transferred onto the brand. These things work both ways, though.
18 songs mentioned.
Stop it. So I just wanted to show you this example. Oh, not this example. Sorry. This example. In the Grey Poupon example, you see how there's a brand meaning and its culture. it works the other way as well. Just listen to this song for a second.
True love will find you in the end. You'll find out just who was your friend.
Okay, this is a song called True Love by a singer called Daniel Johnston. He's sort of an avant-garde musician from the 1990s who has mental health issues. And he makes these, he makes these like really roughly recorded songs. But he also makes very sweet, romantic songs. And he, like I say, has mental health issues, so he's not intending to do it. But see how this idea of romance gets picked up in a couple of commercials. Oops.
True love will find you in the end. You'll find out just who was your true love will find you in the end. Don't be sad, I know. You'll find out just who was your friend. Don't be sad, I know you will. Listen to promise and don't feel like true love will find you if you look. Can it find you?
And so all these different adverts can use the same song because the song represents something quite romantic, something very sweet. In this example, it's about a lonely man and a lonely woman at work. Shut up. In this example, it's about a couple eloping. In this example, it's about loving your dog. The dog trust, yeah? Which maybe some of you have had something to do with, right? So the song becomes about being lonely, looking for love. Well, if you go back to the original, the meaning of this song was not about that at all. Daniel Johnston, this is, like I say, is a very troubled individual who had huge mental health issues. And this is a song about his mental health problems. It's not a song about getting a dog. It's not a song about eloping with a really beautiful wife or meeting somebody at work. It's the opposite of that. But the meaning can change in the movement. So the song in this example, the meaning of the song changes when it goes to being a brand. In the same way that in Grey Poupon, the meaning of the brand can go back into the cultural text. This is the movement of meaning. And again, when you read into it, if you read into it, it's an empirical question. How is it that a particular brand gets its meaning from the wider culture? And researchers literally will pick a brand and try to understand that. Or they'll look at a cultural text and try to see how does it feed into lots of different brands, all of which are trying to become the icon. Okay, any questions? Good. Cool, great. Okay. Is that because you're all getting tired or because you've got no questions? Well, let's try the no questions one. So the final thing I wanted to look at in cultural theory is critical cultural perspectives. You can really simply summarize these ideas. Basically, they say that all the things that we talked about up to this point, cultivation, changing cultural values, the movement of meaning, are bad. So you're probably familiar with various social movements which have argued against socially constructed ideas of beauty that we started off the class with. That argue that if you're creating culture with the basis of selling products to people, you can actually end up having some damaging effects on you. So here the argument is if you don't look like the socially constructed idea of beauty, you don't look like that girl that we started off with, there's something wrong with you. You need to change. And critics say, well, that's not good. That's a bad thing. One of the reasons they say this is bad is because the way that branding and marketing communication is produced is it tries to make beautiful people look even more beautiful than it's possible for them to look. So you're probably familiar with the Dove Real Beauty campaign, which shows how you can take a normal person and make them look incredibly beautiful if you use all the techniques for advertising. And critics argue that when it comes to something like our idea of beauty, the idea of what's beautiful in advertising is not possible for anybody to achieve. It's not even possible for the models themselves to achieve, which is why they have to be airbrushed and edited. And these photo shoots are set up and they take days, weeks to plan and prepare. It's not the case that Beyonce just turns up, someone takes a photo and she goes. She doesn't look like this in real life. So the argument is, in one body of critique, that what branding and marketing communications does is it shows us unrealistic images of what's good, of the life we should live, of what we should look like and how we should behave. So it cultivates something that's unrealistic. We're never going to live up to it. Why are we never going to live up to it? Because even the models themselves don't live up to it. That's why they have to be airbrushed and edited. And it's argued amongst various critical cultural theorists that this has very damaging effects on people as they try to emulate these images that they just can't emulate. They can't look like this because nobody looks like this. And if you're consuming the product because you think it's going to make you young, because it's moved the meaning, it might make you think you're going to be young, but it probably won't make you younger because nothing can make you younger. So you'll always be frustrated. So critics point out this is not really a good way to have a culture. If branding and marketing communications can change culture, it changes it in a bad way. Another argument has been that in the movement of meaning from culture onto brands, it's a little bit unfair because the brands that successfully become icons through the movement of meaning, they make a lot of money from that. If you're Coca-Cola, the value of your brand is something like $100 billion, just your brand, as a cultural value. If that has been constructed by using a cultural text, a song, are you going to really reward that person? Can you possibly reward that person? Maybe not. It's also been found that in many cases, brands take ideas from culture without paying people at all for them. It's also been argued by critics that brands don't just transfer the meaning from cultural texts. Brands actually change cultural texts, often for the worse. So this was a recent example of a mum blogger, a family blogger, who gave up blogging because she had sponsorships from brands to take photos of her family eating breakfast cereal and using particular household products. And it was supposed to just be her blog, her Instagram page. But then the brand started saying, no, we don't like that photo. Can you change it? Can you make your kids look a bit better? Can you look happier? And she got sick of it. She absolutely hated it. If you're interested in understanding this, there's a really cool movie called The Greatest Movie Ever Sold. It's a documentary which explores how brands change cultural texts. They'll go in and say, in this movie, we don't want you to show that because it makes our brand look bad. And so people that are supposed to be producing art, movies, entertainment have to change what they're doing to make things into adverts. And critics say this is a bad thing. Maybe you don't, maybe I don't, that's up to you. And this has led to resistance amongst cultural producers. So you see a lot of cultural producers trying to stop this movement of meaning by saying we don't want our cultural texts to be used for advertising. So this is this press article from last year, I think. A guy from there's a group called the Beastie Boys. I don't know the Beastie Boys, they're a rap group. I like them, but you don't. When he died, he put in his will that none of his music could ever be used for advertising purposes. And since he's died, the Beastie Boys lawyers have gone around suing brands which use his music. Because he doesn't want the meaning, the cultural value that he's created to be transferred and moved on to brands. It gets complicated, of course it does. I often think back to, where did the quote go? I don't know. One of my favourite musicians, I lost the quote, where did it go? Wait a second. There you go, perfect. There's a Gap commercial. The musician that used it was called out by a lot, it was an independent musician, was called out by a lot of other musicians for being sellouts, for making money by letting advertisers use the song. He said, well, the thing is, they paid me for it. Nobody else was going to pay me for my music. And it's very nice for the Beastie Boys to be able to say no one can use our music, but they're millionaires. This guy was a struggling musician. He had no choice. But it's a huge area of debate in cultural theory. Cultural expropriation and appropriation. The idea that brands take values created by cultural producers, move them onto their brands, and then they capitalise on them. They make lots of money out of it. Okay. Has anybody got any questions? I whipped through those critical perspectives pretty quickly. But what I'm going to suggest is that we just talk about the assessment now. Because we've got like 10, 15 minutes left. Is that okay? Cool. So I was going to ask you to do a task, but we don't have time. So let's go for the assessment. The assessment, if you're unfamiliar with the course, is 100% coursework, so it's an essay. Well, it's sort of not an essay, it's a written piece of work. It's a 3,000 word literature review. 3,000 words, literature review. A number of people have asked me over the last week or two, what do I mean by a literature review? And how's it different? And what do we expect you to produce? So I wanted to spend a bit of time talking through that and what you're asked to do. There's a list of topics that you can write your literature review about. If you want to write about something that's not on that list of topics, you can. I don't advise you do it, but you can if you want to. But you need to come and speak to me about it. The list of topics that's available, and I'll show them in a minute, has indicative reading lists on Moodle, which are there to get you started. A couple of people have emailed and said, can I only read the things on the reading list? And the answer is no. And some other people have said, can I not read the things on the reading list? And the answer is no. The reading lists are there to help get you started. And the aim would be for good students that they're going to at least read that reading list and hopefully then use that to go and do some independent research. Okay. So what's a literature review? What do I want you to produce by a literature review? A literature review, for this course at least, and I know you're doing a literature review for critical marketing as well, the marketing students in here. For this course, a literature review is not an essay. What do I mean by that? An essay will ask you a question and ask you to answer that question. And in your writing in an essay, you would justify your answer to the question. You would consider evidence that supports your argument, counter-arguments, and you would respond to those counter-arguments. Right? In a literature review, you don't do any of those things. Okay? So a literature review is not about answering the question. The purpose of a literature review is to explain what we know about a particular topic and what we don't know about a particular topic. Okay, so what are the points of agreement and what are the points of disagreement in an area of research? In describing that agreement and that disagreement, you would explain what kinds of evidence do people use to reach an agreement? What kinds of things don't we know? What kind of evidence would we need to settle any disagreements? So a literature review is an attempt to demonstrate your understanding of a topic by exploring what's the current state of knowledge in that topic. Okay? This is kind of a key point, current state of knowledge. What do we know and what don't we know? So does that make sense to people? just as a rough starting point. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to read into a topic to understand what are the broad themes that people are trying to understand, what are the main theories, what's the main methods that are used, what do people agree on, and what do people disagree on. In order to write your assignment, there's quite a lot of resources on Moodle. If you've not had a chance to look at them, I would recommend it because we're starting to get to a point where you can start your assignment. So there's some instructions, you've got some writing and referencing and style guides, and I've got feedback from previous year's assignments. A word of warning, the previous year's assignment was 4,000 words. So the feedback is not completely transferable because the expectations were slightly different. Last year this was designed as a 15 credit module, so students had to show a little bit more work. Okay? So don't take the feedback as gospel, don't think of instructions you have to follow. There might be some mistakes. So in the instructions, it tells you that you've got a list of topics that you can choose. This is the list. I'll quickly talk you through the list. So far we've looked at psychological theories, sociological theories, cultural theories, branding, marketing, communications. So, gender portrayals, this is a cultural theory. It's related to cultivation. Social theory and criticism relates to the sociological theories that we covered last week, things like Marxist critiques of branding and marketing communications, and picks up on some of the issues we talked about a few seconds ago. Rhetoric is what we looked at in the first week, and is research looking into brand rhetoric. Product placement and content, we're going to talk about that next time. Processing theory is information processing theory, psychological theory. Outdoor advertising, we're going to talk about that. Semiotics, we've looked at this lecture, and we talked about it a little bit in the first class. Interactive and online advertising, you'll find a lot of that research is psychological research, informed by processing theory. But it's just applied to online examples. A lot of it is quite behaviouralist as well, because it looks at the relationships between particular types of stimuli and particular types of interactive behaviours, like clicking on the advert or liking things. Industry ethics, we look at in a couple of weeks. Effective messaging, we look at in a couple of weeks. Cultural values, we looked at today. Brand value, we look at in a couple of weeks. Advertising avoidance and attitude theory are psychological studies. And the advertising industry is again we look at. So if you want to pick anything apart from product placement content, outdoor advertising, industry ethics, effective messaging, and advertising industries, we've already covered the material. You can start your work on assignment now. We're going to get into those ones in the next couple of weeks. If you want to get a head start, you're interested in them, of course, please come and talk to me. So that's the topics. What I'd really recommend that you do is, and people don't do this particularly, but I'd strongly recommend it, is go and have a look at the reading lists. Look at the readings, and if you think they're really boring, pick a different topic. Okay? Because what can happen is students think, well, do you know what, I'm interested in interactive online advertising, but it turns out they're not. They're interested in what they think about it, not what the research is. And the research is the research. So go and have a look at it, and if you look at this and think, I thought it was going to be really interesting, but it's not, it's really boring psychological theory stuff. Okay, don't just pick one and say, I'm doing that now and that's it. Just have a look at some abstracts, flip through some papers. In the instructions page on Moodle, you'll find the marking rubric. This is how your work is going to be scored. So I'll just quickly talk through it, because there is no mystery to how we're going to mark your work. We're looking for a couple of things. So we're going to be asked to develop an argument. An argument is not an answer to the question. An argument refers to the way that you've been able to structure the literature. Have you accurately been able to organise the literature to identify the main important questions? Have you been able to assess the literature accurately? This is your position on the literature, how you've synthesised it, how you've positioned yourself in relation to that literature. It is not to say, this is good, this is bad. It is not to say, my answer to the question is blah, blah, blah. But it might be to say, in order to answer this question, we would need to find an answer to the following hypothesis. Or we would need to do a study like this. Okay? Or in order to answer this theoretical question, we would need this type of data. So that's what we mean by an argument. It's how you've organised the literature to demonstrate what the current state of knowledge is. You're asked to describe in the review why the area of research is important. Who's it important to? Is it important to practitioners? Is it important to wider society? Is it theoretically important? That's fine, but you're asked to give a statement about who it's important to and why. Okay? Now, if you just say, it is important, you don't get very many marks. If you say, it is important practically, because practitioners need to know this information because of blah, 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 you get good marks. Obviously, the blah, blah, blah has to actually say something. Comprehension. Do you demonstrate a full understanding of the topic? Okay, so some people read a couple of papers and make it up. Some people read lots and lots and lots and just get confused. Both of those things are bad. The idea is that you've developed an understanding of the topic that allows you to accurately depict the current state of knowledge. It doesn't mean you have to have read every paper in the whole world. It doesn't mean you have to have come up with all the ideas yourself. If in one paper it says, you can think of this literature as comprising two schools of thought, and you take that argument and say, in this paper they say literature comprises two schools of thought, and I'm going to present that. That's fine. You've got to demonstrate you have an understanding of the topic. Next, we're looking for you to demonstrate that you've actually gone into the literature properly. So we want you to demonstrate that you've gone into sufficient depth. That is not literally a number. It's not that we say 10 articles is good, 20 articles is better. It depends on the topic. Some areas of literature, like psychological theory, as we talked about, is one of the most researched areas in branding and marketing communications. Processing theory is one of the dominant models. So there's thousands of papers about it. So in order to demonstrate accurate depth, you've got a lot more things to look at. Some topics have far less written about them, so we're going to have expected you to have read almost everything. The processing literature, there's lots. We don't expect you to have read everything, but we do expect you to have read quite a few things. Things like social criticism or semiotics, there's stuff there, but there's not as much. Brand rhetoric, it's quite a specific literature. So actually, you could probably have read almost all of that literature. Okay, so please don't come to me and say, have I read enough papers? It's not a number. It depends on the topic and how much you understood from that. Salience, we're expecting you to reflect the current state of knowledge. So that means you need to have up-to-date literature. Again, that is not a number question. It doesn't mean you can only reference things from 2018, because different topics have progressed in different times. Some of the most dominant theories in processing theory were developed in the 1950s. That is the current state of knowledge. So it's fine for you to have a reference to the 1950s. Interactive and online advertising has really only developed in the last 15 years. So if you've got a reference to the 1950s, that would be problematic. Right? So again, it's a judgment call on your part. Have I understood the current up-to-date literature? Doesn't mean published this year, but I know it's the latest thing that was published. It might have been 10 years ago. If that's the last thing that was published, it's the last thing that was published, right? So that's what we're looking for. And then you're going to be assessed on the quality and relevance of the sources. Are you drawing on research and books from reputable authors and reputable outlets? Generally, if something says Journal of Branding, Advertising, Marketing, that's okay. If it says something like International Journal of Scandinavian Branding and Online Ad, that's not okay. Right? That's too specific. If you don't know who the main researchers are in your topic, or what the main theory is in your topic, and you can't see where do they publish, you've probably not got a very salient review, you've probably not got an institution there. So typically, these three criteria go hand in hand. Students who do well on one of them, do well on all of them. Because you've understood what the quality sources are in your topic. Okay. Any questions about these criteria? No? Okay, let's keep going. Then finally, we're testing your ability to communicate effectively. So, there is a style sheet that you're asked to follow. If you don't follow it, you don't get the marks. If you do follow it, you'll get marks. And we're looking for high-level communication skills. That means your assignment needs to be organized, it needs to use proper paragraphs, it needs to use proper grammar, it needs to be proofread and not have typing mistakes in it. It needs to have proper referencing done correctly throughout. If you're unsure how to do any of those things, ask, that's fine. This is what the style sheet looks like. The style sheet asks you to format your work in a certain way. Somebody did email me because it says here, typically the introduction should be around 6 sentences long. Somebody emailed me and said, so does that mean it has to be 6 sentences long? No, it doesn't. It means typically it will be around 6 sentences long. Yours might be 1 sentence long, it might be 7 sentences long, that's fine. If it's a page long, not fine. Right? But have a look at this, it tells you each section should have a title. This is how you format the title. If you don't like this font, it doesn't matter, that's the style sheet. Okay? Because good communicators communicate in the way they're asked to communicate. This is an example of a literature review from last year, which got, I think, 80%. Hopefully you can see it looks pretty similar, right? Now, it doesn't look exactly the same because there's little tricks to catch you out. Look to see here. What happens there? There is no tab underneath the heading. There's a tab, so she can get perfect marks because she didn't fully follow the style sheet, so be very careful. You'd also like to see, this is longer than 6 sentences. That's fine, because it's very clear how it's been organised. One of the things we're looking for is for you to very clearly state what you're going to do in your literature review, what each section is going to tell the reader, why each section is there. That's a good literature review with good communication skills. Oops. Right, so there's that. Then what was the thing I wanted to show you? Yeah. You'll see there is various writing guides which will advise you how to communicate effectively. I strongly recommend you look at them. We've got referencing guides. If you're not sure how to reference accurately, please do go and have a look. As I say, with the previous year's feedback, it's there for some help. Don't just read it and think that tells you what to do. Some people do that approach. It's not the best approach. Okay, we've got no time left, unfortunately. Sorry, my timing's not very good for these classes. I'll be hanging around outside, so if you've got any questions about the assignment, please just come speak to me. And next week, we'll be looking at macro effects of branding and marketing communications and considering the media.